Let's face it, today's fish have it pretty easy. Sure, they have predators and pollution to deal with, but overall, they live a pretty good life, with easy access to everything they need to thrive. Although, this wasn't always the case. Millions of years ago, being a fish was like drawing the short straw of evolution. Imagine an ocean where predators the size of buses lurked in the depths. Oxygen levels could vanish without warning, and mass extinction events were always on the horizon. This wasn't some underwater horror story. It was the brutal reality of one particular era called the Devonian period. Often called the Age of Fishes, the name might sound like it describes an aquatic golden age. But for the creatures living through it, the Devonian was anything but idyllic. So, what made the Devonian seas such a death trap? Well, many factors, as we're about to find out. There's one thing for sure. This truly was the worst time in history to be a fish. Let's start by setting the scene. The Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes, was a time of unprecedented underwater innovation. Stretching from roughly 419 to 359 million years ago, this era saw the seas teeming with life, a dazzling diversity of fish, and the birth of evolutionary adaptations that would shape the future of life on Earth. Like I said, if you were a fish in this era, it might have seemed like the golden age of existence, except it wasn't. The oceans of the Devonian were vast and thriving ecosystems, with shallow reef systems stretching across the globe. These reefs, built primarily by ancient corals and sponges, supported an intricate web of marine life. Unlike the reefs we know today, Devonian reefs were dominated by jaw-dropping creatures that seem almost alien to us now. At the heart of this bustling underwater metropolis were the placoderms, the armored giants of the Devonian seas. These fish, some of which reached lengths of over 20 feet, were a marvel of early evolution. Dunkleosteus, a famous placoderm predator, was the apex of apex predators. It had a jaw so powerful it could crush bone, and its head was covered in thick plates of armor, making it both a tank and a weapon. Alongside them were the early sharks, sleek and efficient hunters that hinted at the designs we'd see millions of years later. But it wasn't just the large predators that thrived. The Devonian oceans were a nursery for evolutionary experimentation. Fish had recently evolved jaws, a revolutionary development that allowed them to bite, chew, and hunt in ways their ancestors couldn't. This was also the time when lobe-finned fish, the ancestors of all land vertebrates, began to develop stronger, limb-like fins. These adaptations were laying the groundwork for a monumental shift, the eventual move from water to land. For a while, this balance worked. But nature has a way of reminding life that nothing is permanent. The very factors that had made the Devonian ocean so rich and vibrant were beginning to shift. Subtle at first, like changes in the climate or slight disruptions in the ocean's chemistry, these shifts would soon grow into a global catastrophe. The Devonian oceans, once the cradle of evolutionary brilliance, were quietly becoming a trap. And as a fish living in those waters, there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. The trouble started with Earth's changing environment. During the Devonian, tropical forests spread across the land, soaking up carbon dioxide and cooling the planet. While this was great for terrestrial life, it wasn't so kind to the oceans. Glaciers began forming, locking away water and causing sea levels to drop. Shallow seas, which had been biodiversity hotspots, started to disappear. Then came the nutrient crisis. As plant roots disrupted the soil, they released nutrients like phosphorus into rivers, which eventually flowed into the oceans. This triggered massive algal blooms similar to today's red tides. These blooms blocked sunlight and, as they decomposed, sucked oxygen out of the water, creating vast dead zones where most marine creatures couldn't survive. Anoxia, or oxygen depletion, was a silent but devastating killer. Coral reefs, fish, and countless marine species were hit hard. Habitats turned into wastelands, forcing survivors to flee or perish. And these changes weren't gradual. The Devonian experienced two major extinction events that wiped out large swaths of life. The first major extinction, known as the Kellwasser event, struck around 375 million years ago and delivered a crippling blow to marine ecosystems. Reef-building organisms such as corals and stromatoporoids, which had dominated the Devonian seas, were among the hardest hit. These reefs had been the foundation of rich marine habitats, supporting a wide variety of species. With their collapse, entire ecosystems unraveled, leaving many marine species without shelter or food. But the worst was yet to come. Roughly 16 million years later, the Hangenberg event delivered the final, devastating blow to the Devonian world. This extinction, around 359 million years ago, marked the close of the Devonian period and was particularly brutal. It brought widespread anoxia on an even larger scale, as well as a sharp global cooling. Massive environmental shifts swept through the oceans, leading to the extinction of many of the period's most iconic creatures. This included the armored placoderms, such as Dunkleosteus. These apex predators, so successful during the height of the Devonian, were unable to adapt to the rapidly changing conditions and thus went extinct. So now we know a bit more about the brutality of the Devonian environment. But apart from that, why was it the worst time for fish? Well, as the most diverse and abundant creatures in the seas, fish bore the brunt of the upheaval. The factors that had once fueled their success now worked against them, making survival a near impossible challenge. Think about it. Who suffered the most from the infamous KT extinction event? The dinosaurs, of course. Why? Because they were everywhere. The T-Rex had no chance of surviving the asteroid, but you know who did? Tiny amphibians who could wait it out, hidden in the marsh. In the same vein, fish were the rulers of the Devonian oceans, but this dominance came at a cost. With such a wide variety of fish filling almost every ecological niche, they were particularly vulnerable to any disruption in the environment. When oxygen levels plummeted due to anoxia, fish, like most animals that rely on oxygen for survival, were hit hardest. Unlike corals, which could survive in low oxygen environments by slowing their metabolism, or trilobites, which could burrow into sediment for safety, fish didn't have these advantages. They needed constant oxygen-rich waters, and when those disappeared, so did their habitats. To add on to that, as we explored earlier, the Devonian oceans weren't a stable environment. Climate shifts, fluctuating sea levels, and collapsing ecosystems created a world where fish had no room to adapt. Predators like Dunkleosteus and early sharks found themselves hunting in ecosystems that no longer supported their prey. Therefore, as you might have guessed, the collapse of fish populations had devastating ripple effects on the marine food web. With fewer fish, larger predators struggled to find food, and their numbers dwindled. Coral reefs, which had relied on the balance of predator-prey interactions to maintain their ecosystems, turned into barren underwater deserts. Some species managed to survive. This wasn't the case, however, for the placoderms, the armored giants of the Devonian. Their large, heavily armored bodies made them slow and inefficient in adapting to new challenges. Despite their dominance as apex predators, they couldn't survive the rapidly changing oceans. Ultimately, the Devonian was a perfect storm for fish. As the most abundant and oxygen-dependent creatures in the oceans, they were uniquely vulnerable to anoxia and ecosystem collapse. Just as the dinosaurs were hit the hardest by the KT extinction event, the fish's dominance over the Devonian seas made them a prime target for extinction. Like most evolutionary stories, though, this one has a silver lining. The Devonian extinction may have been a catastrophic chapter in Earth's history, but it also set the stage for some of the most significant evolutionary milestones. In the wake of devastation, life adapted in unexpected and transformative ways. One of the most remarkable outcomes of the Devonian extinction was the emergence and rise of tetrapods, our ancient four-limbed ancestors. Now, you might have heard before that there was a period in history when fish transitioned to land. Well, this was it. Among the survivors of the Devonian's harsh conditions were lobe-finned fish, a group uniquely equipped to navigate shallow, oxygen-poor waters. These fish had fleshy, muscular fins supported by bones, which allowed them to walk along the seafloor or even venture onto land in search of food or safety. As aquatic habitats became increasingly unstable, these adaptations gave lobe-finned fish a critical advantage. Over millions of years, their fins evolved into primitive limbs, and some species transitioned fully to life on land. These early tetrapods would eventually give rise to amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and, ultimately, humans. The Devonian extinction also marked the end of the placoderms, the armored giants that had once dominated the seas. Their downfall left a power vacuum in marine ecosystems, allowing other groups of fish to flourish. Cartilaginous fish, like sharks and rays, began to rise in prominence, taking advantage of the open ecological niches. Similarly, teleosts, bony fish which had more lightweight and versatile skeletons, diversified rapidly. These bony fish would go on to become the ancestors of the vast majority of modern fish species we see today. The extinction of placoderms also marked the end of an evolutionary experiment in heavy armor. The streamlined, more agile designs of sharks and bony fish proved to be better suited to the changing oceans, shaping the course of marine evolution for hundreds of millions of years. You might also wonder what happened to the ecosystem's post-environmental collapse. Well, it didn't bounce back overnight. The Devonian extinction left behind a battered and fragmented world where life had to rebuild from scratch. Coral reefs, which had been the foundation of marine biodiversity, took millions of years to recover fully. New types of reefs eventually emerged, built by different species of coral and sponges that were better adapted to the post-extinction environment. On land, plants continued to spread and evolve, stabilizing soils and transforming the atmosphere. These changes created more complex ecosystems, which in turn supported a wider variety of life. The Devonian survivors laid the groundwork for the rich, diverse biosphere of the Carboniferous period that followed. While the Devonian extinction was a tragedy for marine life, it was also a turning point. It cleared the stage for new evolutionary experiments, from the rise of tetrapods to the diversification of modern fish. The devastation forced life to innovate, adapt, and push into new environments, setting the stage for the complex ecosystems that would emerge in the millions of years to come. But even though it led to something great for life in general, let's not forget that the Devonian period was truly, undoubtedly, the worst time in history to be a fish.